the door that was never opened. He stood alone in the longest hallway of the mansion, surrounded by marble floors, glass walls, and the quiet hum of wealth pretending to be warmth. This was a man the world called untouchable, a billionaire whose name opened doors in capitals, courts, and boardrooms. Yet here, outside a single bedroom, his hand refused to move. The door had remained closed for years, sealed not by a lock, but by avoidance, fear, and a shame he never learned to name. Behind it lived his son, not gone, not broken, just unseen. The house celebrated victory loudly. Portraits, awards, and headlines framed the walls, proof of power earned and influence respected. But this corridor told another story, one built on hesitation and distance. Every step toward the door echoed with questions he buried beneath success. What kind of man conquers the world while abandoning a child within his own home? Whispers returned as he stood there, doctors choosing careful language, advisors warning about image and optics, friends suggesting distance as responsibility. Somewhere along the way, he accepted the lie that presence was optional when provision was generous. Loving from afar felt easier than confronting his own discomfort, so the door stayed shut. Days blurred into years. Silence hardened into routine. Inside that room, life continued without him. The son learned early what silence meant. Silence meant footsteps passing his door without stopping. Silence meant hearing laughter elsewhere, and understanding it was not meant for him. Silence meant realizing that in a house of abundance, attention was the rarest currency of all. He became invisible in plain sight, learning to shrink so others could stay comfortable. Now the billionaire felt the weight of it. His fortune suddenly felt thin. Power could buy influence, not forgiveness. Time, once wasted, could not be negotiated. Backlist door was no longer just wood and hinges. It was a mirror, reflecting every excuse he made to protect reputation over responsibility. Image over intimacy. His fingers hovered inches from the handle. Opening it would shatter the story, he told himself. Keeping it closed would confirm the truth he feared. As his breath caught, one question filled the silence, daring him to finally listen. He did not know it yet, but that hesitation would define everything that followed, reshaping power, legacy, and the meaning of strength he thought he understood, all his life completely. But to understand why this door stayed shut for so long, we need to go back to how this family was built on silence. A man who owned everything except connection. To the outside world, he was untouchable. A man whose signature could move markets, reshape policies, and silence rooms full of skeptics. Cameras loved him. Politicians praised him. Commentators called him proof that merit still mattered. Power followed him everywhere, reinforcing the belief that dominance was the same thing as worth. He learned early that emotion slowed men down. Vulnerability complicated negotiations. Compassion distracted from results. So he trained himself to speak in certainty and act in control, rewarded every time applause drowned out doubt. Boardrooms taught him how to win. Headlines taught him how to perform. Slowly, without noticing, success became a mask. He never removed that at home. That mask hardened into distance. He believed providing everything meant feeling nothing. Money replaced presence. Structure replaced affection. He scheduled life the way he scheduled meetings, efficient and impersonal, convinced that order was love. When discomfort appeared, he labeled it weakness and moved past it without looking back. Disability unsettled him because it disrupted the narrative he sold to the world. It asked for patience instead of performance, adaptation instead of dominance. Rather than confront that challenge, he avoided it. He hid behind experts, protocols, and polite language, turning neglect into professionalism. What he called protection was fear wearing a tailored suit. No one challenged him. Staff complied. Advisors softened truths. Society rewarded him too much to question his absence. In elite spaces, emotional distance was praised as discipline. A powerful man was never asked what he sacrificed to stay powerful. Silence became normal. Distance became justified. The villain in this story was never rage or cruelty. It was ego, polished into respectability, pride disguised as responsibility, image obsession framed as leadership. Every award reinforced the lie that winning excused abandonment. Every interview taught him how to speak about values without living them. He built an identity around being needed everywhere except where it mattered most. The phone always rang. Crises always demanded him. He told himself absence was temporary, that there would be time later, that love could be postponed without consequences. Yet seasons passed, birthdays blurred, and the house learned his footsteps as signals of authority, not comfort. In public, he spoke about family as an abstract value. In private, he treated it like a liability to manage. Each choice felt small, reasonable, defensible. Together they built a wall no fortune could tear down, and while he stood at podiums preaching resilience and opportunity, quiet dignity waited elsewhere, unseen, unacknowledged, learning patience in the shadows of wealth that never reached the heart. The greatest cost of his success was not measured in money, but in connection withheld, and the person most affected by that absence lived just down the hall. The son the world never saw. He existed in the quiet corners of the mansion, a life measured in shadows and soft footsteps, while the rest of the world celebrated his father's name. He learned early that attention was conditional, love often silent, and worth measured not by character but by convenience. Disability made him invisible in plain sight, a presence acknowledged only when convenient, a problem to manage rather than a person to embrace. Yet within the walls of his room, a universe unfolded. Books, sketches, notes, and ideas stacked neatly around him told stories no one outside could imagine. His mind, rich and restless, moved far beyond the physical limitations the world projected onto him. In silence, he crafted worlds, solved puzzles, and questioned assumptions adults never bothered to answer. Every page turned and every model built became proof that intellect and imagination do not adhere to society's narrow definitions of ability. Outside whispers drifted through the whole staff conversations, hushed debates between advisors, and the occasional sharp remark of impatience cut through the mansion's luxury. It's just easier this way, one would say. We can't let him slow things down, another muttered. He absorbed it all, each word forming the weight he carried in private. Shame was projected onto him like a shadow he could never outrun, and slowly, he learned that to the world. He was a liability, not a legacy. Still, he did not allow bitterness to dominate. Each day he transformed judgment into discipline, invisibility into introspection, and silence into skill. His room became a sanctuary where his intellect, sensitivity, and creativity thrived. While society judged his body, he cultivated a mind that could not be confined. Even among the mansion's grandeur, he noticed the irony. Wealth celebrated by outsiders could not measure the currency of human dignity. Power admired from afar could not buy understanding or respect for difference. In these moments, he saw clearly how elites often conflate ability with worth, seeing those who differ as inconveniences rather than innovators, labeling sensitivity as weakness, and rewarding conformity over courage. Every day, he grew stronger, in solitude, sharper in thought, and more aware of the stark divide between his father's world of influence and his own world of resilience. The mansion, despite its size, could not contain the magnitude of his inner life, and the quiet defiance in his heart hinted at truths the father refused to see. But the father believed he understood his son, assuming limitations to find him. He could not have been more wrong. The lie that kept them apart. Every relationship has its unspoken rules, but in this house, those rules were dictated by fear disguised as wisdom. Advisors whispered about appearances, doctors suggested caution, and peers nodded approvingly whenever the father distanced himself. The message was always the same. Disability was something to manage, to contain, to control, not to nurture, not to celebrate. It was a burden, a risk, a reflection of weakness that could threaten the carefully constructed image of success he had spent decades building. The father accepted this quietly, not out of malice, but because society rewarded it. In elite circles, emotional labor was optional. Visibility of struggle was inconvenient. Protecting one's reputation meant keeping certain truths behind closed doors, literal and metaphorical. And so he did what he had always done. He avoided. He delegated. He convinced himself that love could be measured in provision rather than presence. The room down the hall, filled with the sun's quiet brilliance, became a mirror he was too afraid to look into, a reminder of his moral failure and the human connection he had abandoned. For the son, the door was not just wood and hinges. It was a symbol of the lies everyone around him perpetuated, that he was less than, that he was fragile, that his potential could be ignored. Yet within those walls, resilience grew. He learned to transform absence into strength, judgment into insight, and silence into action. His intellect, imagination, and quiet dignity thrived precisely because the world refused to see him, proving that the hero of this story was not the man celebrated on magazine covers, but the boy who persisted without acknowledgement. Society's fear of difference had created a chasm that wealth could not bridge. Every whispered conversation, every cautious recommendation, every nod of approval for distance, reinforced the father's belief that he was making the right decision, yet each act of avoidance widened the gap, building years of isolation that money, power, and influence could never undo. The mansion, so full of acclaim, echoed with emptiness in the spaces where connection should have existed. The villain in this story was not cruel by choice, it was fear, stigma, and the societal bigotry that told him neglect was acceptable. But the hero, quietly, patiently, and with unwavering dignity, waited behind that door, proving that true strength does not require applause. The room had become a battleground of perception versus reality, a place where courage existed without recognition and hope refused to die. Then one night a single moment forced the billionaire to do the unthinkable. The sounds behind the door. It was past midnight when he heard it. Not the usual quiet that had become a companion in the mansion, but a rhythm, deliberate and alive, threading through the hallways like a pulse. At first, he thought he imagined it, perhaps the wind, perhaps the hum of the air system, but no, there it was again. A low vibration, a sequence of sounds that hinted at order, structure, and intent. Curiosity and unease battled in his chest. He had ignored the room for years, convinced that distance protected both him and the boy, but now something demanded his attention. He paused, straining to listen. Was it music? A voice reciting ideas? The click of pens and papers? The scratching of thought made tangible? The sounds were unfamiliar, yet precise, revealing a life that had flourished without him. He remembered every whispered conversation, every suggestion from advisors and friends about keeping the boy contained and safe. They had convinced, in that separation was necessary, that too much attention could spoil, overwhelm, or even harm. And yet, these noises challenged that entire worldview. Purpose could not be contained, not even behind walls built of neglect and fear. Each step toward the door heightened the tension. His mind raced, imagining possibilities. Perhaps the boy had built a fortress of solitude, a private domain where time was his own. Perhaps he had cultivated skills, knowledge, or art that the father had never bothered to witness. Maybe, just maybe, the boy had grown into someone he could no longer recognize, a person shaped not by absence but by resilience, intelligence, and imagination. The sounds grew clearer, more confident, as though they carried their own demand. That the world, or at least the father, pay attention. The mansion that had always felt controlled and predictable suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Every creak in the floor, every distant echo emphasized how long he had ignored what mattered most. In that moment he felt a creeping awareness of his own blindness, how wealth and influence had shielded him from truths unfolding right under his nose. For the son, these sounds were life asserting itself. They were evidence of creativity, organization, and independence, a quiet declaration that the world's assumptions could not define him. Each note, each voice, each deliberate sound was proof that absence had not stifled him. It had refined him. And for the father, the whole way stretched longer than ever before. Every second heavy with anticipation, every heartbeat warning that what awaited behind the door would challenge everything he thought he knew about strength, worth, and legacy. What he finds behind that door will shatter everything he thought he knew. The door opens, reality hits. He reached for the handle, fingers trembling, heart hammering in a rhythm that matched the anticipation coursing through the hallway. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. What he saw inside stopped him cold. The room was not a place of silence or stagnation. It was alive. Every corner brimmed with proof of intellect, creativity, and purpose. Papers filled with plans, and designs lay meticulously arranged. Sketches of inventions, digital schematics, and intricate models occupied shelves and desks. Charts, notes, and framed ideas hinted at strategy, activism, and innovation work he had never imagined his son capable of. All cultivated in secrecy, all flourishing without recognition. Art covered the walls. Paintings, sculptures, and crafted Objects that revealed a sensitivity and vision far beyond what society or even a father had expected. Technology hummed quietly in the background, machines, devices, and organized systems that suggested ingenuity, not limitation. There were notebooks labeled with dates, detailing projects aimed at helping others like him, initiatives that merged compassion with intellect. Every piece of evidence pointed to one undeniable truth. The son had built a universe of brilliance entirely on his own. The father staggered backward, his mind reeling, shock mixed with guilt and awe. Every assumption he had made about weakness, limitation, and incapability dissolved before his eyes. The boy he had ignored, the child he had treated as a burden, had been quietly shaping a legacy far greater than his own. Every dismissal, every absence, every excuse now felt like a betrayal not just of his son, but of his own moral responsibility. For the son, this was not a moment of confrontation. He had lived through years of neglect and misunderstanding, yet, in the way the room reflected his efforts, in the clarity of his accomplishments, he asserted his presence without need for apology. He had not asked for recognition. He had only demanded the dignity of space to grow, and that he had done spectacularly. The mansion, once a fortress of ego and appearances, now felt small, insufficient. Every opulent feature seemed hollow against the reality of what had been quietly achieved in the shadows. Social hierarchies, accolades, and power structures could not compete with the ingenuity, resilience, and moral courage displayed in that room. In his mind, the world's reaction was instantaneous. Wait, he did all this alone? It was a disbelief shared by anyone who had underestimated him, a disbelief that mirrored what the father felt at that very moment. Years of assumptions shattered, leaving nothing but truth exposed and undeniable. And yet, as overwhelming as this revelation was, the father sensed deep in his chest that the biggest revelation was still to come. The moment the father breaks, the son looked up, calm, measured, and utterly unshaken. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, only clarity. He explained the years he had spent building, learning, creating, how every whispered doubt and every absence had been met with quiet determination rather than despair. He described the projects, the systems, the work to help others like him, each sentence carrying the weight of resilience and intelligence that had been ignored for far too long. The father felt it, immediately, a crushing mixture of shame and awe. He realized that the greatest failure of his life was not the neglect he feared, not the absence he thought mattered most. He was underestimating the very person he had claimed to protect. Every assumption about limitation, every projection of weakness, every carefully justified excuse came crashing down. The child he had overlooked was not broken, not dependent, not fragile. He was brilliant, self-sufficient, and morally grounded. For the first time, the father felt his own powerlessness. The empire, the accolades, the influence, all of it, suddenly, seemed meaningless compared to the integrity, the courage, and the dignity sitting calmly before him. He wanted to speak, to explain, to reclaim time lost, but words failed. All he could do was listen, and in listening he understood the depth of what he had missed, that love is not provision alone, that presence is not optional, and that underestimation is the cruelest kind of neglect. The son's grace was devastating. He did not demand recognition, nor did he seek vengeance. He simply allowed truth to stand, unyielding and undeniable. That calm certainty, the quiet confidence of a life lived fully, despite absence, struck harder than any anger could have. In that room, the father confronted the stark reality of his own limitations and the infinite potential of the son he had failed to see. Every lesson he had ignored, every moment he had postponed, now confronted him directly, leaving no place to hide. And once the truth escaped that room, it couldn't be contained. When the world finds out, word spread like wildfire. Staff whispered, stories in hallways, emails circulated secretly, and soon the media caught wind of what had been hidden for years. Social platforms erupted with disbelief and admiration. People marveled at the son's brilliance, sharing images, designs, and excerpts of his work. Disability was no longer framed as limitation. It was celebrated as resilience, ingenuity, and strength. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in. Wait, he did all this alone? Why did no one see him before? This changes everything we thought we knew about potential. The sun became a quiet symbol of greatness, a reminder that brilliance often thrives in the shadows, unnoticed by those blinded by privilege and power. The father's empire, once the pinnacle of influence and control, now felt small, fragile, and incomplete. Wealth, accolades, and dominance could not match the moral and intellectual legacy his son had built in silence. The tables of perception had shifted, and the world was watching a reversal of expectations unfold in real time. But healing doesn't come from headlines. It comes from choices. A different kind of legacy. The father returned to the room, not with gifts or promises, but with attention and presence he had long withheld. The walls that once held silence now held conversation, laughter, and shared understanding. The son, no longer hidden, welcomed him not with resentment, but with the cautious grace of someone who had learned patience in the absence of acknowledgement. They began to rebuild what had been lost. Step by step, imperfect, fragile, and human, their connection was real for the first time. Wealth could not buy these moments, and influence could not recreate them. Only time, care, and willingness could dot in that room. A new legacy took shape, one defined, not by dominance, accolades, or appearances, but by presence, dignity, and the courage to see and honor the humanity of those we love. The lesson that hits home: true wealth is never counted in dollars or accolades. It is measured in presence, in empathy, in the courage to truly see those closest to us. Power fades, perfection fails, but dignity and connection endure if we choose them before it's too late.